We live in a dangerous world. We live in a world where evil exists. Anytime an American life is lost, we grieve the loss of that life. But there are times when a life is lost through an accident, through something that was not intended, and then there are times when an American is murdered. And even worse, when a governmental entity is actively and aggressively incentivizing that murder. Taylor Force was a fellow Texan. He grew up in Lubbock, Texas. He was a West Point graduate. And in 2016 in Tel Aviv, he was murdered by a 22-year-old Palestinian terrorist. This wasn't just a random act of street crime, but it was deliberate terrorism targeting an American. And as Lindsay described, the Palestinian Authority didn't treat this as a criminal act. They didn't treat it as the heinous act that it was. They treated it as something to be celebrated and, in fact, to be paid for. The Palestinian Authority's Martyrs Fund every year pays the family of terrorists who target and murder Americans and murder our allies. To put in perspective just how big this fund is, there are over 500 Palestinian bureaucrats who are responsible for getting $350 million a year to the families of terrorists. This is big business. Now, when Taylor was murdered, we saw Congress act. We saw Congress act in a bipartisan way, come together and say, Taylor will not have died in vain. We're going to change the policies. When the Taylor Force Act came into effect, though, the Palestinian Authority continued its reprehensible practices. And as a consequence, U.S. funding was cut off by the previous administration. Unfortunately, the Biden administration reversed that decision. One of the first decisions the Biden administration put into place was to open the spigots to send again hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, even while they continue to pay the families of terrorists, even while they incentivize the murder of Americans. Now, I know the argument is, no, it comes from one account, not the other account, from the left hand and not the right hand. Money is fungible. And I'm going to suggest a very simple principle, which is we should not send one penny of federal taxpayer money to any organization that is celebrating, that is rewarding, that is incentivizing, that is causing American citizens to be murdered. Stuart and Robbie, thank you for your courage. Thank you for taking the unimaginable grief you've endured and turning it into fighting to change policy. Nothing we do here will bring Taylor back. But what we do here may stop the next young man, the next young woman in the Middle East from being murdered because of American policy that sends hundreds of millions of dollars to a governmental organization that is funding and incentivizing that murder. It is indefensible that a penny of U.S. taxpayer dollars should go to fund this murder. And I'm proud to stand with Tom. Thank you for your leadership. Lindsay, thank you for your leadership. Steve, thank you for yours. I'm proud to stand with my colleagues, to stand united in saying we are going to protect American citizens abroad, and we should stop the horrific policies that incentivize their murder and terrorists. Steve Davis.